From Recorded Future News, this is Click Here. I'm Dina Temple-Raston. Back in the winter of 2023, Joe Marshall found himself sitting in a Palo Alto steakhouse with a delegation of 10 guys from Ukraine. He'd been a last-minute addition to the invite list.
The account manager who was sort of shepherding them while they were in the United States was like, hey, we're going to have dinner. Why don't you come hang out with us?
The group was from a company called wrinkle. They're in charge of electricity transmission in Ukraine. And these days, electricity generation and transmission in Ukraine is a crazy hard job. Not just because there's a war going on, but also because Russia has been singling out the Ukrainian power grid for its fiercest attacks. And their missiles and drones have managed to damage almost half of the energy infrastructure there. Almost half.
And then you see in the news kinetic strikes and just the horrors of war being inflicted on Ukraine.
Several people were killed when the missile arrived in Vyshhorod. The Russians presumably aimed for the nearby power plant and missed.
Joe works at Cisco Talos, and his specialty is cybersecurity. In fact, he had a cyber talk all ready to present to the delegation the next day. But he also happens to be very familiar with the ins and outs of power generation.
I am a power grid security practitioner, but that wasn't the nature of the meeting. So I didn't want to, force an agenda.
He didn't want to make these guys talk about power, but, well, if the conversation went in that direction, Joe wouldn't mind. So he orders a Pilsner, a 15-ounce ribeye, medium rare, and then starts to chat up the group.
I had to break the ice a little bit, introduce myself. I just started asking slowly but politely questions.
And he began with the obvious questions. And then, because he says he just couldn't help himself, he began talking about power grids.
So I basically said, what's going on? Especially with you guys trying to keep the power and the lights on.
And Joe says as soon as he asked that question, it was like opening the floodgates.
They told me about, cruise missiles and these Iranian drones destroying their substations and their critical infrastructure. They told me ways they were having to make do with what they had.
What they had, meaning just half the power grid that they used to be working with. They had all these crazy stories about how they were MacGyver-ing components. They were even welding transformers back together after the Russians had destroyed them.
Which is insane to me. Insane to me.
Which, apparently, you just don't do.
Because you don't want to be around a transformer that's potentially been damaged and you just re-energize it. It will explode.
And then they mentioned this other thing that was driving them crazy, GPS jamming.
I never even heard of this problem before.
Both Russia and Ukraine have been jamming GPS satellite signals. It's a battlefield tactics thing. Jam the satellite signal and you can make it harder to pinpoint the location of enemy forces or send GPS-guided missiles off course. And it turns out jamming GPS satellites was affecting a lot more than just weapons and intelligence. Those GPS satellites circling over Ukraine are actually used for all kinds of things, and one of them is to tell time. In fact, a lot of industrial systems use the clocks inside GPS satellites to synchronize their operations. And it turns out when Russia or Ukraine jam the signal, Ukraine's power grid would just freak out.
It kind of goes into a panic. It goes, look, if I can't timestamp this frequency measurement data to send to you so you know the health of your grid, well, I'm just not going to send you anything.
I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and this is Click Here, a podcast about all things cyber and intelligence. We tell true stories about the people making and breaking our digital world. And today, a story about satellites, electronic warfare, and the next frontier in digital hacking.
We operate under a false sense of security. It wouldn't take much to cause disruption in satellite communications and to throw things off track.
Stay with us. Joe Marshall never finished that beer or that $80 steak. He said he was talking so much and asked so many questions that he kind of forgot about them.
My brain is reeling from these wild stories they've already told me, and this GPS one was just sort of stuck in my little neurodivergent brain, and I said, wow, you guys don't have GPS.
And for our purposes, all you need to understand about GPS satellites is that the US maintains about 30 of them, and they're orbiting the Earth above us, transmitting very precise data to GPS receivers on the ground. They tell us things like latitude, longitude, altitude, speed, bearing, and even keep perfect time, which is what the guys from wrinkle were focused on.
You know, power is this invisible thing to all of us, right? We just turn the lights on and they come on and we watch our TVs. But the infrastructure that's created to make that happen is an incredibly complex ballet of producing the power, regulating the power to an acceptable voltage, and then getting it to your home, for you to enjoy civilization.
And when you have something that complex and interwoven, in order to make it work seamlessly, you need a kind of benchmark. And Ukraine was using GPS time as that benchmark. They used it to synchronize very complex operations throughout the network just by time-stamping everything.
Time-stamping everything exactly accurate to everything else that we're measuring at the exact same time over tremendous distances. The Ukrainian transmission grid alone, which is different from like what you would get to your house, that's what we call distribution. The Ukrainian transmission grid alone is 25,000 kilometers long. So we're talking about a reasonably big chunk of wires.
Joe says to think of all the messages that need to be relayed and received throughout the network as this incredibly choreographed thing, like one of those marching bands in the Rose Bowl parade.
You've got a band trying to move in step and play at the same time.
And if the marching band is 25,000 kilometers long, like the Ukrainian power grid, one way to keep everyone in step is to have them all on the very same precise clock, like that drum major at the front of the marching band with the baton, keeping time. So if you're a power transmission company, you'd be saying, we're moving a power load from Kharkiv substation at 12:01 to the Irpin substation. And it would reply, all good, ready to receive at that exact time, all in perfect synchronicity. But if you can't count on the drum major, that GPS satellite, then you've got a problem. Do I pronounce your name Taras? Is that right?
Yeah, it's correct pronunciation.
Excellent. How do I describe what your job is?
Okay, my job is I'm head of the dispatch and control system department in Ukraine with generation stations, with DSO.
Sorry, what's a TSO?
Transmission system operator. It's a company which is responsible for transmission and dispatching electricity through the high voltage lines.
Wrinkle, that company we talked about before, is a transmission system operator. And it was a delegation of their employees who met Joe at that steakhouse in California. And Taras Vasilev was there eating with him, talking about the GPS jamming problem.
Joe is very interesting about our cybersecurity situation, what is happening with these attacks. We're trying to find solution.
Taras is a very precise-looking guy. Short hair parted crisply on the side, and his polo shirt, well, the top button is buttoned. And he says that he'd been preparing for war with Russia before the invasion ever began. Everyone assumed if Russia was going to invade, the first thing it would attack would be the power grid. And at the time, Ukraine's transmission system was connected to Russia and Belarus. It was a vestige of the old Soviet era. So, months before the invasion, Taras and his team began making plans to connect the Ukrainian grid to the European one. And in order to do that, Taras had to show European power regulators that the Ukrainian grid could communicate with theirs seamlessly.
So our grids must work together.
So as Putin was amassing Russian troops along the border with Ukraine, Taras and his team were providing tons of data to European regulators, trying to set up communication lines. When you connect to the European grid, is that so they can provide some power to you?
Exactly.
But funny thing about power grids, one of the things people who are on the same grid want to make sure about is if something goes wrong, well, it can be isolated, that it won't affect other people on the grid. So, Ukraine had to show that it was able
to switch off our grid from their grid in case of significant emergency.
And they did. And sure enough, less than a month after Russian troops poured across the border into Ukraine, Taras and his team had managed to set up that connection to Europe and had a guarantee that they could get power from Europe if they needed it.
We physically connect March 16.
Which is a pretty remarkable thing.
So what does it mean for Ukraine? That in case we emergency, we have this possibility to receive the electricity from Europe. So it was our main task, and I'm very proud.
And how did they sync all their operations up? You guessed it. Europe uses those GPS clocks too, which meant that Taras's genius plan to count on European power in an emergency would also be in trouble if the satellite jamming continued. When we come back, Joe and Cisco Talos come up with an idea.
I kind of just started picking up the phone and calling people going, do you have any time experts? And which is a very bizarre question to ask somebody, by the way.
Stay with us. Taras Vasilev was incredibly frustrated. Every time air raid sirens sounded outside his office, he could predict, by almost counting off the seconds in his head, how long it would take before the lights would go out. But it wasn't because the Russian bombing campaign was getting any more targeted. What was causing the lights to flicker was that GPS jamming. Russia was stepping up its bombing campaign, so Ukraine was jamming satellites more often.
When we have air alarm,
the siren would sound, GPS jamming would start.
Our military started to block this GPS signal, so GPS jamming occurs at the moment.
Which would then knock the substations offline.
And during all the period of this air alarm, they cannot use the system because significant part of substations are lost from point of view of data connectivity.
In other words, the substations couldn't talk to each other. They couldn't tell where they needed to route electricity, so they just went down. This, Taras said, is what he was hoping Joe and the Cisco people would fix. Your cell phone uses GPS time by connecting to a satellite with an antenna that's inside. In commercial applications, the GPS antenna looks like a hockey puck.
It's nothing exciting. And it has a cable coming out of it that feeds into a device that can take these signals from a satellite and then decode and then make them accessible to equipment that would want to use that timing for its timestamps or for its job, right?
When it loses that signal, it loses visibility. It doesn't know what's going on in the power grid at a specific location. And as Joe said earlier, the system kind of panics. And when an industrial system panics, it does what systems do. It just switches off, lights out. So Joe started calling around, a lot.
I kind of just started picking up the phone and calling people.
Explaining this to anyone who would listen.
Do you have any time experts? The crystal oscillator has a cable coming out of it. You've got about 30-ish or so satellites. Satellites is an atomic clock. Eventually, I landed with a team of outright experts.
People who understood time, power grids, industrial controls, and they all came to the conclusion that Joe was looking at this all wrong. He didn't need to build some crazy thing to prevent GPS signals from getting jammed. All he really needed was a clock. And remember, Joe works for Cisco, so he thought,
maybe we could innovate a clock that we happen to have laying around, so to speak,
like the gadget that displays the time in your cable box,
and give that to them that would be just as good for their requirements. So it wasn't perfect, but good enough.
They did a hack job.
I'm giving you my dirty secrets. Basically, the hack that we have done is, to put it very, very broadly, when satellites are not available for whatever reason, solar flare, warfare, whatever, our device steps in and says to the power equipment, don't panic.
Don't panic, it says. Here's a backup clock. Did you basically invent something?
So I think innovate would be the better word. We have hacked a switch.
They actually hacked an industrial Ethernet switch that they use on oil rigs and in other harsh environments.
We're talking, it's really cold or it's really hot or it's damp. And because of that, the equipment inside of them is a better breed of durable. That also includes the clocks that we put inside these things, because you got to put a clock in everything.
The switch has its own power source, a way to network, and as far as the Ukrainian power network was concerned, the clock was good enough to prevent the system from panicking when the GPS signal went down. They made some software modifications, tweaked a chip so it would function seamlessly, whether it was reading the GPS clock or the industrial switch one, and then they wrote some algorithms that basically allowed the switch to recognize the signal was down and to provide a best guess of what time it was when the GPS was lost. And together, that was enough to stop those GPS clock-inspired blackouts.
They are all over Ukraine right now, helping to keep the lights on for the Ukrainians. They have other problems, obviously, but we kind of solved this one.
Ukraine has been full of lessons about modern warfare. There have been cyber lessons and supply chain lessons, and now the GPS jamming lesson. It's only become clear with this latest conflict that satellites are in the crosshairs too, and they're going to get hacked. In fact, back in February, there was a little bit of a panic about exactly that.
The United States has been tracking Russia's development of a nuclear-capable anti-satellite weapon in space.
This is not to drop a nuclear weapon onto Earth, but rather to possibly use it against satellites.
The worry is about the risk faced by the global network of satellites, over 8,000 of them.
It was a false alarm. The anti-satellite technology hadn't been deployed and was still under development. But it focused minds on the possibility.
I'm not aware of a validated hack that has occurred in any open source forum yet.
This is Jonathan McGrath. He used to be on the U.S. Cyber National Mission Force and is now a consultant at GuidePoint Security. The actual hacking of a satellite hasn't happened yet.
But I think that we would be foolish to not be afraid that that will happen.
What has been hacked is a satellite link. Moscow cracked into a Ukrainian satellite internet service provider called Viasat to disrupt military communications when the invasion began. In 2022, a Russian hacktivist group called Killnet performed a distributed denial of service attack against SpaceX's Starlink system. And what about hacking the satellites themselves? Arguably, they're just as vulnerable. And Jonathan says that's one of the things the Space Force is supposed to look into. In the meantime, Taras said the Cisco solution for his GPS problem has been a godsend. Before the switches went online this winter, Ukrainian power went out every time there was an air raid siren.
We have such days when we have 3-4 air alarms per day. So it was very significant.
Now the Cisco switches are keeping the lights on.
Your heart aches because these are people you care about, and it certainly changes you. And it breaks your heart. It broke mine.
This is Click Here. Here are some of the top cyber and intelligence stories of the past week.
Good afternoon, RSA Conference. Wonderful to be with all of you today. And now we finally know what Ferris Bueller did on his day off.
Every year around this time, tens of thousands of people descend on San Francisco for the RSA conference. Companies make product announcements and policymakers talk about tech. And this year, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken gave the keynote address.
Now, it's true that move fast and break things is literally the exact opposite of what we try to do at the State Department. But
he used the occasion to announce a new strategy aimed at creating a kind of digital solidarity with American allies around the world. The idea is to establish both digital rules and norms and then hold threat actors accountable when they break them.
We're committed to working with any country or company that's committed to that same vision, not just American firms.
The 54-page plan is the State Department's first formal cyber strategy in over a decade.
Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Also last week, the alleged leader of the Lockbit ransomware gang was revealed, at least according to US, UK, and Australian law enforcement. They've indicted a 31-year-old Russian national named Dmitry Horoshev for a roster of cybercrimes. They say Horoshev is the gang's top administrator, Lockbit Sub, with a $10 million reward for any information that might lead to his arrest. We interviewed Lockbit Sub after the announcement, and he claims the authorities have the wrong guy. And finally,
TikTok sued the U.S. government, trying to undo the legislation signed into law last month that would force its Chinese parent company to sell within a year or see it banned. TikTok and
on Tuesday, the popular social media app sued the U.S. federal government over the new law. TikTok argues that the law violates the First Amendment. Lawmakers say the app presents a national security risk because China would be able to collect information on users and could potentially use the app's power to launch disinformation campaigns. The case is expected to go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Today's episode was produced by Sean Powers, Kat Shuknecht, and me, Jade Abdul-Malik. It was edited by Luokowski, fact-checked by Darren Ankrum, and contains original music by Ben Livingston, with some other music from Blue Dot Sessions. Our staff writer is Lucas Riley, and our illustrator is Megan Goff. Click Here is a production of Recorded Future News. We'll be back on Tuesday.